During the Vietnam War era, a time of immense conflict and discord in our country, one woman took a stand for the innocent victims of war. While passionate war protesters were in city streets and on college campuses, and fervent fighters against communism were in the jungles of Vietnam, a young woman named Betty Tisdale was fighting her own war, that of nurturing and protecting the orphans of Vietnam. Vietnam is a country that has seen more than a century of war and turmoil. The French invaded Vietnam in 1858, capturing Saigon in 1859. This started a century of colonialism by France. The Japanese occupied Vietnam during World War II, then the French tried to retain Vietnam as a colony after the war had ended. As a result of the 1954 Geneva Accord, Vietnam was partitioned at the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh supporters in the north. During the time given by the Geneva Accord for Vietnamese resettlement, 900,000 Vietnamese moved to the south and 100,000 moved to the north. Vietnam was then cut up in the Cold War between communism and democracy, leading to the Vietnam War in the 1960s. All these years of war produced numerous orphans in a poor country that was unable to care for them. As a result of European, American, and Australian involvement in Vietnam, many biracial children were born. These children were labeled children of dust, since they were considered to have no identity. While not true orphans, these biracial children were often abandoned by their mothers at the gates of Vietnamese orphanages. They faced discrimination and a dismal future in the patriarchal society. Betty Tisdale, born Betty Mole, was a young lady working as a secretary for U.S. Steel in New York during the 1950s. With a good job and a promising future, Betty was not following the typical homemaker of American woman. The usual mold of a homemaker was broken forever after Betty read Dr. Tom Dooley's book, Deliver Us from Evil, in 1959. After learning about his work with Vietnamese orphanages, she realized that she needed to take a stand for these abandoned children. At first, they gave $5, thinking that was enough to help the orphans. However, she felt convicted to take a more active stand, and she contacted Dr. Dooley, who was hospitalized with cancer in New York City.
I read a book written by Dr. Tom Dooley called Deliver Us from Evil, and I saw his picture on the cover, and he was a very handsome young man, and I thought, this is going to be interesting. So I read his book, and I became so involved in what he was doing that when he died, shortly after that, about a year later, I could not get him or the children out of my mind, and that was the beginning of what I've done for the rest of my life.
After the doctor's death, Betty took over his work. She used her life savings to travel to An Lac Orphanage in Saigon 14 times and started raising money to support the orphanage. She also quit her job at U.S. Steel for a job as personal secretary for New York Senator Jacob Javits, knowing that this position would help her to fundraise for the orphans. This type of assertive stand was not common for a woman during this period of American history. In taking a stand for the Asian orphans, she refused to take no for an answer.
I don't think that anyone should listen to the word no until they have exhausted all avenues.
Betty was very creative in her methods to obtain assistance. These were bold moves for a woman in this time period. During her many trips to Vietnam, Miss Small met and married an army doctor named Patrick Tisdale, who was one of the numerous soldiers volunteering at An Lac. Dr. Tisdale was a widower with 5 boys, and Tisdales then adopted 5 Vietnamese girls. Despite the challenges of raising 10 children, Betty Tisdale continued to support An Lac. American soldiers helped at the orphanage providing food and milk for the orphans, installing water pumps, and even protecting the children while they played outside. In fact, American soldiers helped throughout Vietnam.
Well, I think back on the young men that I served with, and I would estimate that over half of them made an effort to reach out to the people, to work with the orphans, work with civilians.
Mrs. Tisdale's stand was to honor Dr. Dooley's belief that the orphans should receive education and care in their own country, since they are the future of Vietnam. Since her goal was to raise future Vietnamese citizens, she was not a registered adoption agency. Betty's stand changed in 1975. After many years of war, the North Vietnamese were close to claiming Saigon as Ho Chi Minh City, but he was afraid that if the 400 orphans of An Lac were not evacuated to the United States, that they would be conscripted into war service or even killed. So she moved mountains and minutes, taking a very active stand protecting the children. As part of the evacuation of Saigon's endangered orphans, the President forged Operation Baby Lift In April 1975, Betty convinced U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin to provide planes to airlift the children of the United States. She also arranged housing and medical care for the sick, fragile children once they were flown out of war-torn Vietnam.
I thought, well, where am I going to put them when I bring them here? Well, I'm living in Columbus. It's right next to Fort Benning. I see a lot of empty barracks. I'll call the general. So I called the general at Fort Benning, and he never returned my call, and I was frantic because I was leaving the next day. So I decided that I would call the Secretary of the Army, Bo Calloway, in Washington, D.C., and he never returned my call. So I called his mother, and I said, Mrs. Calloway, your son is not returning my call, and I really desperately need to find out if I can get some barracks at Fort Benning to put the children in. And she said, leave it to me.
The first flight of Operation Baby Lift was on April 4th, 1975. Tragedy struck with a crash shortly after takeoff, killing 128 on the plane. The following flights of the Baby Lift resulted in 1,700 Vietnamese children immigrating to the United States. As part of Mrs. Tisdale's stand for orphans, she faced major challenges in obtaining authorization from the Vietnamese government. The South Vietnamese would only approve for the adoptions of children under age 10, since they wanted the older children to fight the war. Also, all orphans needed birth certificates. Most children had just shown up at on-lot gates, and they didn't have the required paperwork. But this would not stop Betty Tisdale's heroic stand for these young victims of war.
So I immediately went back to the orphanage. We typed up the names and the so-called birthdays, made up names for over 400 children.
Mrs. Tisdale and Madam Knight also tried to include in the manifest children that were actually older than age 10, but due to illness and malnutrition, looked younger than their actual age. On April 9, 1975, Betty Tisdale took off from Saigon with 220 orphans from Mon Lac. One baby died from illness en route. 219 orphans arrived at Fort Benning, Georgia, where they received housing and medical care, all being adopted within 1 month. Mrs. Tisdale's stand for the orphans of Mon Lac was not without controversy. A class action lawsuit was filed in federal district court in April 1975, seeking to stop adoption proceedings. The lawsuit alleged that not all children coming to the United States as part of Operation Baby Lift were in fact orphans, and that they should be returned to Vietnam.
So if you asked a child, do you have a mother, they would say yes. And they would say yes because the head of the orphanage was their mother, was the only mother they had.
After the Mon Lac orphans were adopted by families in the United States, some wondered if these children were being treated fairly by placing them in a totally foreign culture. In 2000, Betty accompanied many of the now adult Mon Lac children back to Vietnam and located some of the older orphans whom had been left behind. In 1987, the U.S. government passed the Amerasian Homecoming Act, which permitted 75,000 biracial Vietnamese and immediate family members to immigrate to the United States. This allowed some of the older biracial Mon Lac orphans to come to the United States, including Michael Landstaff. He remembers being placed in a re-education camp in Vietnam, being forced to plant corn and grain, and to sleep on the floor. He was also discriminated against due to his Amerasian appearance. In spite of their challenges, Mon Lac orphans in the 1970s are now role models for young Amerasian children in the United States today. Many peace activists of the Vietnam War era moved on in their lives, leaving their activism behind as part of history. Yet Betty Tisdale, 83 years old today, has continued to take a stand for the youngest victims of war. She supports a vocational school in Vietnam and provides milk for the street children. Mrs. Tisdale also fundraises for a physical therapy clinic in Afghanistan to help with the effects of the war in the Middle East. As Mother Teresa said, "If we have no peace, it's because we have forgotten that we belong to each other." Mrs. Tisdale believes that we're a part of a global society. We have a moral responsibility to help others. She doesn't take sides in war. She chooses instead to take a stand for the innocent children.